War Never Changes. That is the all-encompassing theme of Fallout, a series of post-apocalyptic role-playing games. Even after generations of war and nuclear apocalypse, even after mutants and monsters roam the wastes and violence reigns supreme, war never changes. I've been thinking about Fallout New Vegas a lot lately. New Vegas is one of my favorite games, and I absolutely adore everything about it, so it only seemed appropriate with its 10th birthday coming up that I replay it and really take the time to analyze it, to dissect it and see what it has to say. More specifically, I want to look at what I think it's trying to say as social commentary and as a commentary on itself. Some things, like war, never change. But what does New Vegas have to say about that? Fallout New Vegas is a 2010 role-playing game, produced by Obsidian Entertainment, published by Bethesda Softworks, and directed by Josh Sawyer. Set in post-apocalyptic Las Vegas and the surrounding Mojave Wasteland, New Vegas sees the player character, the Courier, get tangled up in the war for the Mojave. Said war is between a bureaucratic, expansionist, under-equipped army, a 200-year-old business tycoon, and a bald guy cosplaying as Julius Caesar and his army of enslaved tribals. The three factions are fighting for control of both the New Vegas Strip and the still operational Hoover Dam, for the wealth and energy it will bring to their nations. This all happens after the player is shot in the head and left for dead by a completely ridiculous gangster stereotype in a buffalo plaid suit, voiced by Chandler from Friends. The main plot sees the Courier track down their would-be killer and subsequently aid one faction to take over the Mojave, or rule over it themselves with their happy-go-lucky robot friend. It's that kind of game. For a little backstory, Fallout 1 and 2 are set on the west coast of America. But after developer Interplay Entertainment hit rocky financial ground, the rights to a new Fallout game and the series as a whole were sold to Bethesda in 2004. With Fallout 3, Bethesda decided to go their own way and set things up on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. The generally accepted reason for this is that Bethesda wanted to tell their own story in this universe and not be beholden to the trappings of classic Fallout, allowing them a fresh start, as it were. Now, Fallout 3 was a smash hit when it launched in 2008, winning any number of Game of the Year awards and selling millions of copies despite its flaws. The most prominent criticisms were the story issues, the two-dimensional karma system, and very well-documented issues with bugs. Fallout 3 is so buggy, in fact, that I can't even get it to launch, which is why there's no Fallout 3 footage here. The transition from traditional isometric turn-based RPG gameplay to an almost FPS RPG was one of the many steps away from the old-school formula, but it was a resounding success. Fallout was now back in the mainstream, but in the process, a great number of classic fans had been upset. There was some major controversy in Fallout fan sites, most prominently No Mutants Allowed, that Bethesda was tarnishing the cherished Fallout name and basically using the series to make money, which is, as far as I'm aware, the idea of video game publishing. Now, Fallout 3 was derided as not a Fallout game and criticized, not unfairly, for the setting, story decisions, internal logic, and for using Fallout themes without properly understanding them. Here's a quote from prominent No Mutants Allowed member and game developer Vince D. Weller. "It's not even a Fallout game. It's not even a game inspired by Fallout, as I had hoped. It's a game that contains a loose assortment of familiar Fallout concepts and names. Electricity, pre-war electronic equipment, powered and still working computers, just think about that for a second. Working cola and snack machines, weapons, ammo, scrap metal, and even unlooted first aid boxes are everywhere." Now, these weren't unfair criticisms, but No Mutants Allowed still near universally threw Fallout 3 and Bethesda aside to play with their old toys. Fallout 3, in the meantime, released 5 expansion DLC, while the rest of Bethesda began work on the new Elder Scrolls. Then along comes Obsidian Entertainment. A small developer mostly known for doing sequels in other publishers' IPs, Obsidian was, and still is, built on the ruins of original Fallout developers Interplay Entertainment and their subsidiary Black Isle Studios. Although Fallout was the mainstream success for the company, Interplay had cult hits like Planescape Torment, Icewind Dale, and the BioWare-developed Baldur's Gate under their belt. Many of the developers and designers from Interplay and Black Isle moved on to form Obsidian in 2003. including current CEO Fergus Urquhart. Prior to New Vegas, Obsidian had only released 3 games and a single original property, Alpha Protocol, and all of them suffered what is now known as the Obsidian trademark. Big dreams, major bugs, and a whole lot of cut content. They were still generally recognized as flawed, but nonetheless high-quality games. Bethesda, tangled up in their work on Skyrim, contracted Obsidian to work on a Fallout game to fill the gap between Fallout 3 and Skyrim. Work on the new Fallout game, New Vegas, formally began in early 2008. Lead members of the team included lead designer and director Josh Sawyer, lead writer John Gonzalez, and lead artist Joe Sanabria. Now, the critics didn't love New Vegas the way they did Fallout 3, mostly because it was effectively the same gameplay in a different setting, and it didn't do much to update the Fallout 3 formula so much as adapt it. But among the old school fans, it was the sequel they deserved. It was a return to the classic setting of the West Coast. It had the same bitter, biting cynicism and tone. It featured a host of returning factions and characters, and more importantly, it had a very faithful interpretation of the old Fallout tropes and themes. Speaking of, let's dive into those. Now, this game is obsessed with letting go, and I mean obsessed. Every major character, every companion, and every expansion, and so many of the quests are about people who just can't let go of the past. The 3 factions are just as caught up in the past and repeating the grim mistakes that they have done for 200 years. There's the New California Republic, a state struggling to establish itself as the successor to America. Let's take the example the game gives you. A critical zone for the player is Freeside, a slum outside New Vegas inhabited by former tribals and now under the control of the King. The King keeps a loose piece of the city by way of his gang, the Kings, a bunch of Elvis impersonators who worship the King of Rock and Roll as a god because they found a school dedicated to impersonating him. The NCR, during their invasion and occupation of the Mojave, moved into Freeside, settled some of their people, and now gave preferential treatment to those settlers. The war for Vegas against Caesar's Legion has gone on for years longer than anyone expected, and has become a massive drain on the economy, while the NCR politicians continue to champion the cause for their career benefits. Hoover Dam has become a tentative no man's land, the Legion is growing bolder every day, and things are rapidly coming to a head. In case that's not clear, a powerful force has invaded a desert region, suppressed the local population, and subsequently waged a war that has gone on vastly longer than expected. Said war is against a united army currently led by a charismatic man who was trained by and has a long-standing history with the invading force. The entire region is being used as a power play and staging base for their subsequent invasion of the East, and at the center of the conflict is an enormous source of energy. Politicians back home are continuing this war as a way of keeping their careers going, and it is costing lives. They're repeating the same asinine mistakes that America has made for decades now, in lore and out of it, and it is destroying the NCR. That's pretty on the fucking nose if you ask me. Mr. House, meanwhile, is a bona fide relic of the past, so obsessed with saving Las Vegas that he spent a literal fortune to save it during the war. He's an old-school industrial capitalist, determined to prove that the world can be bent to his will, and exactly the sort of man that caused the apocalypse in the first place. Caesar's Legion are probably the straightest example, a group clinging so hard to the past that they are reverting back to a Roman society. They use women as sex objects, crucify and execute criminals, and forcibly assimilate the tribes they defeat into their civilization. They directly model themselves on Caesar's interpretation of ancient Rome. This society, being built on conquest and warfare, cannot go on forever, and Caesar himself openly acknowledges this. In the minor factions, there's the Boomers, the Great Khans, the Brotherhood of Steel, all locked up in their old ways. These are people whose glory days are long gone, and by failing to keep up with the times, they're going to be left behind. The 4 expansion DLC go even deeper into this in the effort to force the idea into your brain. Let go. Begin again. Look towards the future. The past is over. It's not exactly the most subtle theme in the world, but New Vegas isn't the most subtle game in the world either. It's the kind of game that grabs you by your dusty, ragged lapels and shakes you like a doll. demanding that you understand the things it is saying and why they are so important. That's not even touching on the companions, who are undeniably some of the best written characters in the series and possibly in gaming as a whole. They're outcasts, guilt-ridden, drunks, rejects, social pariahs, or grandmothers forgetting the faces of their grandchildren, all absolutely miserable in their determination to hold on to something that is long behind them. What's funny to me is how this game takes some of the old Fallout tropes and totally flips them around. Jacobstown is a settlement in an old ski lodge north of Vegas, occupied by a few dozen super mutants. They're leftovers from the days of the original Fallout, where they were powerful but ultimately just mooks meant for the player to mow down on their way to their creator and master, the real villain of the game. Things get turned around here by the presence of Marcus, a friendly super mutant and another throwback to Fallout 2. He's formed Jacobstown to help rehabilitate the other super mutants and create a small but stable society for them. It's a safe, hospitable, if intimidating town, and Marcus tries his best to keep the town safe and help his fellow mutants leave the past where it belongs. The major questline for the town involves preventing a coup by some mutants, who still believe in the old ways of the Master. And the happy ending is the one where the courier keeps the peace and persuades the dissenting mutants to let sleeping dogs lie. On the other hand, no longer are the Brotherhood of Steel proud and mighty as they were in Fallout 1 and 2 and even in Fallout 3. In the Mojave, they're just a shadow of their former glory, devastated by warfare with the NCR. Clinging to their old traditions, the Brotherhood have isolated themselves from the wasteland and are slowly but surely reducing in number. Several endings involve the player destroying the Brotherhood, while most others see them die out either by NCR expansionism or their own recklessness. Only intervention by the courier, who can convince them to move on, can prevent the ignoble death of the Brotherhood. The implication is that for most people in the Wastes, the Brotherhood and its ideals are irrelevant. Now, just before I started writing this, Microsoft bought Bethesda for $7.5 billion. That's a 10-figure number and the biggest purchase Microsoft has made of any developer to date. For comparison, Microsoft bought Minecraft for just $2.5 billion. But there's an important footnote to the purchase that the industry picked up on really quickly. Microsoft owns Bethesda. Bethesda owns Fallout. Microsoft also owns Obsidian Entertainment. When the news of the Bethesda deal broke, some of the earliest opinion pieces and news articles were about a New Vegas sequel. There were stories everywhere about how a New Vegas 2 was now possible, or at the very least, a new Fallout game from Obsidian. But I think all of those stories have really missed the point. This is a game where the three major factions are all rooted in their interpretations and understandings of what the old world was like, and very few of them have really experienced it. Mr. House is the only one who has seen that world, and he's 200 years old and means to build an autocratic capitalist empire in space. The other two are corrupt and violent to varying degrees, and I mean, come on, there's a side mission where the old style of super mutants clash with the literal personification of the new generation of players. The courier can either keep the peace, or let those schizophrenic, old school mutants lose their minds in the wastes. Better yet, there's a mutant-hating faction of militants, obsessed with holding on to their old traditions and ideals, who must either adapt or die. It's not a stretch to say that this game is a reaction to both its own existence and the fan reaction to the new direction of Fallout. The only way to get anything remotely resembling a happy ending for any faction in New Vegas is to go it alone and create something new. When the player does do that, it's actually a decent ending. Jacobstown becomes a prosperous and safe town for mutants, while the Brotherhood form a tentative truce with the NCR. Things get better. The Mojave sees some positive change, with a sense of safety and stability finally settling on a region that has seen unbelievable upheaval and transition in the last few years. An overall theme of moving on is really prominent in all of Fallout, but I think it's particularly important in New Vegas. This is a game set many years after its direct previous entry in Fallout 2, made by a team who hadn't worked on a Fallout game for years. In fact, they had by and large just moved on. The team at Obsidian had found some relatively low-stakes work and seemed to be mostly comfortable with it, even if they kept up with the Fallout fanzines and maybe grumbled a little about Fallout 3. The fan reaction to 3 can't have gone unnoticed, and it's been a very significant part of the writing and direction of New Vegas. Hell, the existence of New Vegas and the story of its development probably had a huge influence on itself. That this game keeps talking about how important it is to let go of the past and what happened there, whether it's good or bad, is not a coincidence. It's the people who get tangled up in how the past was, either the real past or the one they've imagined for themselves, that fail to look toward a brighter future.